All right, welcome back to U.S. History. This is the Week 2 lesson video. I'm Mr. Rosenleaf. Glad to have you here. So today, this one will be relatively short, but it's a very important concept, really for all of the future of U.S. history. And like to this day, this is an important concept. And that is the concept of order versus liberty. And we're talking about it today in the context of the early American Republic, the early days of the actual United States. So we've gotten through the Constitution, we've agreed to scrap the Articles of Confederation in favor of a document that gives some increased national government power while also retaining rights for the states. But what is that going to look like in practice? How are we going to solve the issues that have already arisen? How are we going to solve, for example, our national debt crisis back then? See, things don't change as much as you might think they do. We still have a national debt crisis. Although we pay the interest on the debt, so it's a problem. I wouldn't call it a crisis. So that's just some of the things that these early leaders are going to have to contend with. But again, this is an issue that comes back again and again and again and again. Where do we draw the line? Where is the happy medium between having law, having, order, for lack of a better term, and having freedom, having liberty? Where do we find that balance? And it does exist on a continuum. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. So, you might know the guy on your screen here. The first president of the United States was, of course, George Washington. And the reason Washington was sort of almost everybody's choice, in fact, he was everybody's choice to be the first president of the United States, was he was really the only national figure the country had. There were some that were sort of approaching him, but he was certainly the best known. He had been obviously the guy that had brought us through the War for Independence. He had been the commanding general of the Continental Army. And what's more, at the end of that experience, he stepped away from his power. He literally, whereas other generals throughout history, I'm thinking of your Julius Caesars, that kind of thing, have literally won a war and come into the capital city with their troops and taken over power. And Washington could have done that. Washington could have gone to Philadelphia with his men. They'd have backed him 100% and said, "Hey, Congress, you don't exist anymore. I am now King George of America." And probably nobody would have said boo about it. But Washington had enough smarts to know that that was not going to be an effective and structured country moving forward. That we needed to move beyond the first president to the second and the third and the blah, 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 right? We have to be able to move between executive leaders. We have to be able to move beyond Congresses, or this isn't going to work. It can't be a cult of personality. So Washington gives up his power and walks away, goes back to Mount Vernon, but he's still active. He still knows what's going on. He is in constant communication with people like Alexander Hamilton, who had been his aide-de-camp in the war and one of his commanders late in the war. He was in contact with his old friends from the war. He was in contact with people like Thomas Jefferson and all of these other people. And he was getting a sense from especially folks like Hamilton and James Madison and these guys that the articles that were governing the country in the period after the Revolution, after the War for Independence, just weren't working. There were too many problems, and you've probably gone through some of these in your reading or in listening to the podcasts. But, for example, huge amounts of national debt. The states could not sort of behave themselves between one another. They couldn't solve trade disputes. There was just so much that a national government should be able to do that the Articles wouldn't let them do. The Articles needed 9 of 13 states to agree to any basic legal changes. If they wanted to change the Articles themselves, if they wanted to amend the Articles, they had to be unanimous. I mean, this was absolute madness, and things weren't working. And events like Shays' Rebellion were happening, where the Articles government could not manage to get that situation under control. They didn't even try. Massachusetts was eventually able to put it down, but they had to hire a private army to do it. This was not a great precedent to be set for this new country. So Washington and others felt that this needed to change, and so they fought for a constitutional convention. And at that constitutional convention, it became very clear that it was really only one guy that was capable of being the first chief executive of this country, and it was George Washington. So this brings us to this idea of order versus liberty, because our Constitution actually does make a balance between order versus liberty, but then our actions beyond that are going to determine sort of where in this continuum we fall. Because on the one hand, you have, if you go all the way over on the order side of the equation, okay, so all the way over to there, with absolute order, no kind of freedom whatsoever, what do you have? You have authoritarianism, you have fascism, things like that. Now, is that truly sustainable? Not really. You can't really control people's thoughts. You can sure give it a try and succeed in some cases, but you can never succeed in controlling everyone's thoughts. Okay, so we're already sort of on the continuum. We can't be on the very order edge of that. Now, if you go all the way down to the other side, on the liberty side, all the way down, what do you have with an absence of law at all? Pure liberty, pure freedom. Well, eventually you get to a state called anarchy. But anarchy also is not sustainable long term. Eventually somebody disagrees with something that happens, and they think that shouldn't be allowed to happen. Well, guess what? You've now added a law. So really, we do exist between the two extremes. Sometimes we go more the one way towards the order side. Sometimes we back off towards the liberty side. I'll leave to you your feelings about the current situation in our country. But at this point, with order and liberty, what we're talking about, sort of the focal point in this early iteration, is the role of the central government, the role of, we would call it today, the federal government. Should the central government have increased powers to do more stuff? Or do we strictly obey the Constitution and say, no, the Constitution says that the federal government can't do this, and it also says that if the power is not enumerated in the Constitution, that it's reserved for the states or the people. So that's kind of the issue here. So those that believed more in the order side of things really felt that there were certain powers, certain responsibilities, certain things that needed to get done that a national government is supposed to do. Sometimes they're inherent in the fact that, hey, it's a national government. The national government needs to have the power to declare war when necessary, for example. And that's actually written into the Constitution. But there were some things that you should be able to do because you're a national government, like establish a national bank, or some kind of apparatus to help you deal with the money supply and taxes and debts and things like that. So, is that stuff allowed, or is that stuff completely not allowed? Is that inherent in the Constitution? Is it implied somewhere in the Constitution? And that's going to be the sticking point there. On the liberty side of things, they're going, the state and the local governments really need to have the bulk of the power, because that's how we maintain freedom, is for the people to be more immediately governed by closer sources than by one Congress or one dude sitting in a capital city especially for a country that's going to be as large as this one. Even back then, dealing with 13 separate states, this is a big country, and it's only going to get bigger as we go, and we'll see that as we continue going through our study of U.S. history. So the Liberty folks didn't want a big federal government, didn't want a big bureaucracy. What's a bureaucracy? Basically the machinations that make government do what it does. And the order people said, yeah, we need a pretty big bureaucracy to do the things that we need to do, to manage the taxes, to manage all of these moving parts. And the Liberty people say, no, we don't need all of that. That can be handled by the states for the most part. We don't need a big apparatus to do this. That the federal government doesn't need to have responsibility over daily life. We don't need a big standing army. We don't need a lot of foreign involvement. We're across an ocean from our nearest neighbor, with the exception of Canada. So, we don't have a lot to do with foreign affairs, and that's good. We don't need to have that, according to the Liberty people. That the Constitution is the limit of federal power, and if it's not in the Constitution, federal government doesn't get to do it. That's the Liberty people. So, where do we come down? Obviously, there is some sort of happy medium here. And all governments exist in some kind of continuum in this order versus liberty thing. So the two guys that are going to really typify this battle in early America are these two guys. Now, you might recognize both of these guys. You might only recognize one of them. The gentleman on the left of your screen. So a lot of people guess, that's John Adams. No, that is not John Adams. Now, but Adams was a member of this guy's political party. What's interesting is that the framers of the Constitution didn't want political parties. They thought that they weren't good, or a lot of them did. And George Washington was not a member of a political party, but he eventually signs on to a lot of what this guy was putting down. So this person will become the first Secretary of the Treasury in this country. And he will be the ideological sort of founder, leader of the more order side of things. That the federal government should have more power, that there are things that the federal government needs to do because they're a national government. And that even if it's not written in the Constitution, that doesn't mean that the national government doesn't need to do it. We have to be practical. This gentleman is the subject of a hit Broadway musical, and I'm not going to sing it for you, but at one point he says to the other person that he's debating with, he says, Welcome to America, we're running a real nation. And basically saying, that what's on the page of the Constitution is all well and good, but at the end of the day, we have to solve actual problems that come up. And not everything can be spelled out in a Constitution as short as ours, and we can't necessarily amend the Constitution every time we need to solve a problem. Okay, so if you haven't guessed it already, the guy on the left is Alexander Hamilton. So the guy on the right was going to be Washington's Secretary of State, his first Secretary of State. He's going to leave about 4 years in because he felt he was being ignored by Washington, even though they were both Virginians. He felt that Washington really was listening to Alexander Hamilton and not him, even when it came to foreign policy. So Jefferson was really the ideological leader of the group that was saying, no, things are limited by the Constitution. I always like to think of this this difference as if you've ever seen a mime perform. Okay, the most famous mime routine of all time is the man in the invisible box. And the mime, if he's a good mime, can't go outside the box, right? He's trapped in the box, right? And so I've always thought of, by the way, this guy's Thomas Jefferson. I've always thought of Jefferson as the good mime, at least at this point. Now, when he becomes president later on, spoiler alert, that's going to change a bit. But at this point, Jefferson's the good mime. The Constitution is the box. You cannot, as a federal power, step outside the box. All right? Whereas Hamilton is the bad mime, or I like to think of him as the drunk mime. The guy saying, hey, I'm a mime. I'm in a box. Look at me. I'm in a box. Oh, my arms are outside of the box. Oh, hey. To Hamilton and those that agreed with him, the Constitution was a nice jumping off point. It was a lovely piece of paper. It had some wonderful ideas. Hell, Hamilton helped write it. But that at the end of the day, real problems had to be solved. These two guys were sort of the main guys at this moment of American history. Washington sort of played that he was trying to straddle the middle. In actuality, he and Hamilton were tight. And so he's going to end up listening to Hamilton. John Adams was certainly part of the political party this guy founds. So Hamilton's going to found a party called the Federalist Party, named after those that were in favor of the Constitution. Ironically, the party that kind of wanted to violate the Constitution, but not violate, bend that sounds nicer, bend the Constitution. And Jefferson's party becomes known as the Republicans, or the Democrats, or the Jeffersonian Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Democrats. They have a lot of different names. The Jeffersonians, they'll go on. This party tends to be fairly well linked, at least in the early days, with a particular person. It starts with Jefferson, ends up with like Andrew Jackson's the next one. These guys are kind of the founders of all of this. Can't play that because I would get content struck. But one of the first issues that these two guys are going to have, and I have a picture from the actual musical up there, is that one of the issues that was coming up under the articles was national debt. That not only did the national government have debts from the war that it had not paid back yet, or in some cases just not paid back, the states had them too. In particular, the northern states. The southern states were able to recover their relatively modest debts very quickly because they were not paying for labor costs the way that the North was. They had slavery. And so they could kind of pay higher taxes and support getting their states out of the debts that they had, which admittedly were not a lot because most of the fighting took place in the northern states, minus Virginia. The other states maybe had a little bit, but not all that much. So in order to solve this issue, Alexander Hamilton, the new Secretary of the Treasury, wanted this financial plan. And he wanted the national government to assume the debts from the war. Not just for the federal government, obviously, they had to assume those, but for all of the states. Basically roll all of those debts. So, if you think that every state had debt, which they didn't, but let's just, for simplicity, 13 state debts added to the federal debt. That way, it's kind of like consolidating your credit card bills into one payment. Kind of like that, to a certain degree. But that way, we're not trying to manage 13 states paying their bills plus the federal government. The federal government's just going to do all of it. All right. In order to help manage this, Hamilton wanted to establish a national bank. This was going to be a private bank, but it would deal with public money, but it would have private investors in it. And it would help deal with the national debt. It would help deal with the taxes that would be brought in from point number 3, the tax on whiskey. So in order to generate revenue, we had not done an income tax. We will not have that until the Civil War. But in order to generate revenue, we had to tax something. And so Hamilton's saying, look, everybody drinks liquor. And at this point, liquor is whiskey. So let's tax that. And the money that brings in can help pay the interest on our debt so that our creditors are happy. They're getting something. and we can kind of work on paying off the rest of it later. Spoiler alert, we do, but then we take on more. And at one point we're paying it down again, and we take on more. Yeah, we're always going to have national debt. So Jefferson, as Secretary of State, so he's in on these talks, even though Hamilton's the financial guy. And Jefferson is, so at this point, Secretary of State isn't just diplomacy, it also has lots of domestic duties. And so Jefferson and Hamilton are kind of the guys that are going to have to carry this out. And Jefferson's like, this doesn't work. Nothing in the Constitution says you can do this. And Hamilton's like, yeah, but we need to deal with these issues. And this is the only way we're going to effectively deal with them. So why are you fighting this? And they are going to have, these discussions and these arguments. Now, if you have the opportunity, please listen to Rap Battle number 1 on the Hamilton soundtrack, which is what was about to play there. Now, they will have another thing later on, but we'll deal with this one at the moment. So ultimately, these two guys are going to get together. These two guys plus James Madison. James Madison was Speaker of the House of Representatives, Speaker of the People's House, the most important person in the House. And Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury, trying to get his plan through the House of Representatives. He was pretty convinced he'd get it through the Senate, but had to get it through the House. And Jefferson offered to serve as an intermediary, even though, obviously, he was not completely neutral on this. But he invites Hamilton and Madison to his home for dinner, and they work out a deal. So this deal basically says that Jefferson, and by extension Madison is at this point Jefferson's shadow. He goes from being a Federalist in favor of ratification of the Constitution to, when Jefferson comes back from France, it's like, okay, I'm behind you, Tom. Basically complete 180. But anyway, Jefferson and Madison will agree to support most of Hamilton's financial plan. I think they ding a point off of it that I didn't mention. But anyway, in return, Hamilton has to get his guys, so the Federalist Party at this point, has to agree to move the nation's capital to the south. In particular, they were looking at a spot between Maryland and Virginia on the Potomac River. This was near enough to George Washington's place, also near to Thomas Jefferson's place, that the Southerners could feel more involved in this government. Hamilton wanted the nation's capital in New York City, the commercial hub of the country, the most populous place in the country, arguably the most important city was the most important city in the country at the time. And really, to this day, continues to be economically and culturally probably the most significant city in our country. So Hamilton had wanted it there, but he was willing to, for the good of taking care of this debt situation, he was willing to say, yeah, I can live without having the capital in New York. Let's get this debt situation taken care of, get this financial system put in place, and yeah, you guys can have the capital. It's fine. So huge victory for Hamilton and all of this, but all of this takes place in a room with Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. Nobody else is there. This is not like a public debate that they consider everybody's input. No, it's these three guys. And you can also listen to the song The Room Where It Happens on the Hamilton soundtrack and kind of get a sense of this to a certain extent. They actually explain it very, very well. So again, I'm going to skip over this because it would play this if you were in my regular class. It would play the song for you. I'm just asking you to go listen to it. Yeah. So this financial system goes into effect. This is going to help the United States have a stable credit rating because we're finally making regular payments on the debt, which is woohoo great. We establish a Bank of the United States to help manage this. Now, I think Jefferson ends up killing the bank. They bring back another bank. after the War of 1812, and then Andrew Jackson kills that one. But even to this day, we have the Federal Reserve now, which basically functions as our central bank. But anyway, not everybody's happy with this, and the people that are least happy are those who are farmers in the western areas of, say, Pennsylvania, and they don't like that the whiskey that they create, that it's what they use, the grain that they can't eat, is distilled, fermented and distilled into a drinking alcohol. And at this point, Americans were drinking more alcohol than they were drinking water, because alcohol was the far safer substance. I mean, water, depending on where you were getting it from, hit or miss, if you were going to be okay. So these farmers in western Pennsylvania are going to basically say, we're not paying your damn whiskey tax. Ain't going to happen. And so they are going to start a rebellion. Now, this could have ended up like Shays' Rebellion, where they have this big uprising and Pennsylvania can't put it down. One of the problems for Pennsylvania here was that most of their militia were in western Pennsylvania and had joined the protest. So they didn't really have a militia to call on. But instead of having to beg the states around them to send troops to help them put it down, now we have a strong national government. And so Washington calls up troops from surrounding states, puts them together as basically an army of the United States, leads them as they march from Washington, D.C. He is leading the way for the first day. Now, Washington's going to turn around and go back to where he's coming from, which at this point I think the capital's in Philadelphia, maybe. Anyway, he's going to turn around, and the troops are going to be led by a Virginian named General Light Horse Harry Lee, another Lee in American history. And the other person is Alexander Hamilton. Remember, Hamilton had been Washington's basically personal number two, not his battlefield number two, but his main guy. And so he puts Hamilton in charge of leading this army along with Lee. And they're basically going to march in. There's not going to be a lot of shots fired or anything like that. The protesters are going to look at all these troops and go, never mind, we'll pay the tax. There's very little shots fired, not a lot of bloodshed. But this shows that the federal government is going to follow through on laws that they made. Congress passed this law. The president signed this law. It is law. And the national government is going to enforce law. And that's something that is very important as we move forward. Fast forward to the 1950s. And this time it's a federal court decision. Federal courts have not only ruled that schools cannot be segregated anymore, a lower federal court has also ruled that Little Rock, Arkansas has to integrate its public schools, beginning with its high school, Little Rock Central High. A building that looks, by the way, remarkably like Great Falls High. Like, it's creepy. Anyway, so the local National Guard and the people of Little Rock are going to lose their minds because 9 African-American students want to enroll in Little Rock Central High. They're going to block their way on the first day. Like, they get into the school, but they have to be taken right back out because, like, the crowd's threatening to burn the school to the ground, kind of a thing. Eisenhower is going to send in, I think it was the 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, one of the airborne divisions of the Army, to literally escort these kids to class for like 6 weeks. Like, anytime they went from class to class, they were accompanied by uniformed soldiers. First time, by the way, that the South had been occupied by federal troops since the end of the Civil War, which was like the end of Reconstruction was the 1870s. So, yeah, 1958, 56, 58 was Little Rock Central High incident. So, yeah, this continues right to this day. We enforce federal law, or we're supposed to. Anyway, So I'm going to leave that there. You should also take a look at kind of what happens after the Adams administration, the Jefferson administration. In class, we'll probably talk a little bit about the War of 1812. Probably stuff you should know about. This stuff will does have mention in your book. You might want to look a little bit of it up just to have a base sense of what you're talking about. Anyway, so in your reflection journal this for this week, I want you to really explore that idea of order versus liberty. What did they mean by order in this case? What did they mean by liberty? What do we mean by those things today? Have we changed? Is it just about, the power of the federal government in economic matters, or are we talking wider stuff here now when we're thinking about today's America, right? And what side do you come down on? Are you more towards the order side of the situation, or more towards the liberty side of the situation? So I will put in post-production that whole thing in a much better form up on the screen here for you. But thank you for paying attention today, and have a great day. And yeah, see you next week when we will start our first unit.